Hey guys, this is Joe Foster with Edelweiss, and thank you for joining us today for data-driven bookselling. This is a presentation that we actually did at Book Expo this year, and my colleague Ruth Bradstreet is going to be presenting to you today. And I did want to just mention that we do have a Q&A, kind of a written sort of Q&A process here. If you should see it in your webinar tool thingies there. But basically, I'll be answering any questions as they come up if you have any. And just want to make sure that you know, too, that this is being recorded, and we will make sure that you guys get a recording, and we'll post it on our website and all that fun stuff. So over to you, Ruth.
All right, thank you, Joe. Yeah, this is right here. I'm the product manager for our analytics tools. And many of you may know already, but we have really spent a lot of our time at Treeline working on the idea of data-driven bookselling. You kind of not necessarily by that name, but we've been exploring and working with these concepts for quite some time. And that's what I'm going to talk about, really about how to make inventory management easier and more effective by using data, and much of that data you already have. I'm also going to share some interesting facts and findings from our own research and work with bookstores across the country, so you can take back some information perspective on your own work back to the store. So with that, I will mention too, if you're already an Edelweiss or a Treeline Analytics user, we're kind of changing the name to Edelweiss Plus Analytics because we're baking it right into Edelweiss Plus. So you will have access to the new version now. We're sort of in the middle of a soft launch, and I will tell you a little bit more about that. So the agenda today is to talk about the approach that we're taking to this data-driven bookselling concept, a case study from the Shelf Report, which is kind of a new branch of Edelweiss Analytics that we're going to be giving to people, and then about analytics as it is in Edelweiss, as I mentioned. So if you don't know about the Treeline, we are in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We were founded by John Rubin, who is from the bookselling world himself, our bookselling family. And our roots are really in inventory management. So the initial product was analytics. The basic idea is to sort of help the book industry see the forest for the trees by getting a more panoramic view of operations, by hopefully to let you save time and money so you can work better and read more, which is our motto. So Edelweiss itself, if you've ever used, I'm sure most of you have used Edelweiss. If you're not familiar with it, really quick, it's a digital catalog platform where most of the major publishers post their front list and even much of their backlist. You can find out when authors are touring, and you can generate orders, you can work with sales reps, sort of depending on which angle you're coming from. But that Edelweiss itself isn't actually why we're so interested in this kind of analysis. As I mentioned, we actually started in this area before we even launched Edelweiss. We started with a product for independent bookstores that helped them use data and workflow tools to manage inventory better, which is actually used by the majority of independent retailers now. And then about 3 years ago, we also released a similar product for libraries that's aimed at collection development, which is similar but different from inventory management. So I'm not here to do really a sales demo of this stuff, but we will leave you some information if you are not familiar with Edelweiss or analytics. I just wanted to sort of set the stage for why we have all this data from booksellers across the country. So our approach to data-driven bookselling, which I'm having a hard time saying today for some reason. So a nice quote, you may be familiar with it, from Peter Drucker: if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So measuring can be the tricky part, but if you don't really know what you're measuring or how to measure it, then you really don't have anywhere to start. Whether it's quantitative or qualitatively, we're measuring things really all the time. The thing is, are you really measuring the right things? And if you don't have data, it's hard to measure an inventory of 1,000 titles. You just can't really keep that kind of data in your heads, especially if you include the concepts of tracking hot titles and trends outside of your store. But what data should you be measuring? I mean, I know your point of sale system has a lot of information in it already, but looking at title lists, which is usually what you can generate from a POS system, isn't necessarily all that helpful either. So what we're doing with this is we've kind of distilled down to what we think are good indicators of an inventory's health into 4 main measures. And the kind of general idea is that if you do these 4 things well, you're probably, your inventory is probably working well and turning well and working well for your customers and so on. So these 4 metrics here I'm going to talk about a little bit. And if you're familiar with Edelweiss Analytics or with Treeline Analytics, you'll get these ideas, but these are little twists on them, slightly different wording and so on, and a slightly different approach to some of these pieces. So what we're looking at is, one of the things is freshness, and that means what portion of inventory has been active in the last year. So this is about, if you've used the newer analytics, you'll see there's kind of a measure of staleness, which means number of days that something has been on the shelf, depending on how many titles there are, that can kind of multiply out, I mean, how many copies of a title there are. So this is something that we can measure and benchmark against other libraries with. What portion is inactive versus active? Relevance, this is an idea some of you will be familiar with from Treeline 2 from Edelweiss Analytics. Which percentage of titles that have sold in over 10% of your peer stores do you carry? So in other words, are you carrying the top sellers? That's kind of a measure. We're using the term relevance to mean that you have kind of the right titles in quotes. And this is showing you, in this case, there are 225 that this particular store the report is on doesn't have. And maybe that's fine. If we're a smaller store, maybe they just don't have space to have everything. So relevance is a little bit dependent on that, but it's also a measure where you can kind of benchmark against other libraries, I mean other bookstores as well. And you can see in this case that they have between, they have 172 titles that between 10 and 20% of stores are selling. They have 52 between 20 and 50% of stores are selling, and just 1 title that is selling in more than 50% of stores. So if I was this store, I might want to know what that 1 title is, just to make sure that's not something we really ought to have. Okay, the third one is called hit rate. And this is sort of a little bit of a new concept. It's the idea, it's kind of a little bit of a measure of success of buying. In the library world, they talk about DOA, meaning dead on arrival, so things that they buy that just never circulate or don't circulate for X amount of months or years. And they kind of try to keep track of that. And that's the same is true, of course, in a bookstore, where this particular measure is for the last 12 months, well, probably more like 15 months, because we kind of go back 3 months and then back a year. Which titles did you buy, which new releases did you buy, recent pub dates, that didn't sell at all, and how many of them sold well and how many of them sold just fine? So in this measure, you can see that 14 of them haven't sold at all. And this is, not necessarily the measure of a buyer's effectiveness. There's always going to be titles that you just don't know. I mean, debut fiction and all kinds of things. You're relying a lot on what your sales rep tells you, what the marketing is for a publisher, if it's something that's not a proven author or topic that you can predict very well. But it does give you a sense of, in certain genres, are you overbuying or underbuying once you get down to the detail of this. The last thing is turnover. Of course, everybody's familiar with this in the bookstore land. How many times does your inventory turn over annually? So the little stats at the bottom are referring to one particular genre. That's why these numbers are so small, but it's saying that this particular genre, you have about 4.5%. It represents about 4.5% of your inventory. At others, it represents less than that, only 3.5% of inventory. I'll get into this in a little bit more detail. But it represents 2.25% of your sales. And there's an average number of copies of 2.1. So that kind of gets into the detail of turn in particular genres and how that compares to other bookstores as well, which is kind of the twist part, I think. So I'm going to move on to show you the next slide, which kind of gets into that a little bit. The quote for this one is, which I like this one, a goal properly set is halfway reached. meaning that if you spend the time and energy to figure out what you're trying to accomplish with your inventory, what you're trying to grow, what you're trying to reduce, what you're trying to kind of refresh or rebalance, this will actually, getting to the goal itself can be tricky. And once you get to that goal, you're kind of halfway to succeeding and improving it. So, sure, you want to be better than you have been in the past, but how fresh, for example, should a section be? And what should you shoot for in terms of turnover or turn for your biography section? These are things that might take a bit of thought and digging into, and that's where the peer data can be really helpful. We build it into it's really a key component of this, how data-driven bookselling works. What's really kind of cool about it is you can see how a genre like art and architecture tends to sell and evaluate your inventory based of those indicators rather than comparing your genres internally to each other. And I know if you've used analytics, that's something that we emphasize quite a bit. You can kind of plot out all of your own categories, and you can see which ones are turning better or worse than others, and then kind of, if you want to, make adjustments to that to kind of bring more into the average. However, what this is actually showing you, if you kind of imagine this is showing you the average across all these bookstores. So, for example, that very first genre, art and architecture, that gray dot is the average relevance. So, in other words, how relevant are they? How many of the top selling titles for art and architecture does the typical bookstore have? And the typical bookstore, the relevance is relatively low, I should say, because presumably these books are expensive. You're not always buying those popular ones. It's a low turning section and so on, but also presumably also one where you often want to have a good inventory for show or for whatever, for display and so on. So and all of these gray dots are the average bookseller performance. So you can see they kind of move back and forth. The things that we found interesting about this is that is how closely some of these dots conform. So the colored dots here are this store, this demo store's success in the metric of relevance. So for art and architecture, you might say to yourself, well, yeah, architecture is not doing great, but that's the same for everybody. Like, you sort of have these ideas in your head about poetry or about graphic novels and how they typically turn, but you don't really know what the typical turn is or the typical performances in other stories, justifying that by saying, well, that's okay because other people are saying, and that's absolutely true. I mean, you make decisions. What we're trying to do with this is not tell you what to do at all. It's really just to describe the data, so you confirm things you already know and make decisions about how to move things around, or perhaps find something new about how your inventory is performing that you really didn't know. But the confirmation part can be really interesting too, which I find here, which is that true. That's typical for the bookstores to be sort of low in this metric for art and architecture. But this particular bookstore is even below that average. So that might be something that's a cue to me as the book buyer, the bookseller, that we might want to take a closer look at this section. So meanwhile, so anything that's orange or red, there's no reds, is moderately below the key at the bottom compared to the peers. And then the ones that are yellow are basically in the average zone. And then the green things are above. So you see there's several categories here that are above average. So they could say, yeah, we're doing a bit better than typical bookstores with business books, a little bit better with house and home and fitness and things like that. And then with the ones, what I was getting at earlier is what we found interesting is that a lot of times there's a very average. There's a very there's kind of a typical pattern where most of the dots are sort of close to the average in a sense. So there are definitely patterns about how categories behave across the board. I think what we found though is that there's a bit more variability in bookstores than there is in libraries. I think because there's more bookstores are of different sizes or niche or genre specific bookstores, or they're just more successful in certain areas, maybe because of demographics. Whereas libraries, we find, tend to be extremely similar in how titles perform across the board, and extremely similar in how much of their inventory, or their holdings in their case, is dedicated to certain genres. One thing I'll mention, since we're kind of looking at this list of genres, is what we're doing here is kind of leading up to, we're actually creating this report that's something that you could actually access as well. But these genres, I keep referring to genres, you might be thinking in terms of BISAC categories. These are very close to BISAC categories, but they are not actually strictly BISAC categories. There's some combinations of them to make them kind of more evenly sized. So if you know kind of the way that the number of titles kind of shapes BISAC, because it's very much a subject category driven thing. It doesn't really make any account for formats, and it doesn't really make any account for the fact that some even top level BISAC categories have only 10% of the number of titles that, say, fiction does. So fiction, just the general fiction top level category is enormous. So we've kind of broken down fiction a bit more and kids' books in different ways so that they're more evenly distributed in a sense, which makes it a little bit easier. So yeah, so I was saying that we're kind of working up to this shelf report that you would have access to. We've launched this already in Library Market, and we're in the middle of sort of testing it in the bookstore market as well. And this is actually part of your Summit subscription if you're already a subscriber. And what it's doing is showing you something like this. So for specific bookstore, like I showed you at the beginning, it's showing freshness, relevance, rate, and turnover. And you can see, if you can, I know it's a little bit small, but you'll see that there's kind of a gray line of each one, and that is the benchmarking against peers. So something like, in this case, freshness is good. The store doesn't have a lot of older inventory. Their relevance, they've got most of the top sellers, they've got some they don't. Hit rate, not so great. They've got possibly below average number of titles that they brought in that haven't sold, or above average, I should say, in that sentence. And then turnover is pretty average. So, and then this report will also have this, the way I showed you the genre, we'll have genres going right through the whole list that I mentioned. And then you can actually be able to click through to the results from this. So if you wanted to see, for example, into freshness, there are X number of titles, in this case, not very many, but there's a few titles that are over 8 years old. So that might be one place to click through. Actually, there aren't any. There's a few titles that are between 4 and 8 years old. So that might be a place to have a look. And this is, so you see I'm looking at youth board books. This is just for one section, so one genre. And again, this is the points out what I said about the BISAC category. So board books, of course, is not BISAC category because it's the format. But this gives you an idea compared to other stores. Now, board books specifically does. You can also drill into here if you've got more than one location too. You can kind of compare this reporting. You can run the report for each one, but you can also kind of compare within the application to see how each store compares for each genre to each other. So I'm going to move on to a case study, as promised. Sort of some of the information, some of the things that we thought was some of the things we were finding interesting as we went through looking at this data from bookstores. So this is a store, fairly typical, nothing unusual about it really in terms of this reporting. So you'll see the 4 metrics here: freshness, relevance, hit rate, and turnover. And they're kind of, and the blue number here is the sort of benchmark score between 1 and 5 for freshness and so on. So they're pretty average. Again, the yellow color coding refers to average. So they're sort of in the average range for relevance, meaning do they have the top titles that are selling? Pretty average for freshness, meaning do they have a lot of titles that are just sitting on the shelves, not selling? And above average for hit rate, so they're doing a decent job of buying, or better than some of their, well, I shouldn't put judgment on that, but every store is a bit different, but they're above average for hit rate in terms of what sells through of initial buys, and also above average for turnover or turn. Oh, yes. And this one, if I go on to the next page, this is sort of taking the next step in from that. So that was kind of the macro level of the library as a whole. I'm sorry, the bookstore as a whole. And also the idea with this too is that you'll be able to compare a period to a period. So in the Treeline Analytics or Edelweiss Analytics, you know that if you've used it, you can go in and you can very dynamically generate all kinds of reports, get to any sort of list and filter for things, but it's real-time reporting. So you're looking, if you run something, you're looking at the state of things now, you're looking at the turn as it is now, and so on. This is something that will run periodically, so you'll be able to compare a quarter to a quarter, or a month to a month, or a year to a year as well, and see if things have changed. Because really, the point of this would be to make a plan. So to decide that this tells you something new, possibly, maybe it doesn't, but find something new and some place to tackle, maybe sort of figure out the low-hanging fruit in your inventory where there's some category that you just know you need to change and either expand or contract or just kind of refresh with some better, newer titles. So in this case study, you'll see, and this is a lot to look at, but what this is showing me in the left-hand side where it says adult nonfiction is that all of the genres in that left column are under adult nonfiction. So things like gardening, sports, biography, all that kind of stuff. And then on the right-hand side, there is the upper section is adult fiction, kind of broken out into genres, and then youth broken out into, or kids books basically broken out into genres. So you can kind of get a sense of the pattern of each one of those groups. And in that first group, where it says adult nonfiction, you can see that the graph on the left shows that there's 17, and this means 17 categories that fall into the average bucket. And you can tell that almost just by eyeballing it. You can see there's tons of yellow dots. In other words, those yellow dots are very close to the gray dots. The gray dots, again, are the average. In this case, this is freshness. So the average freshness, this bookstore is pretty close to the average freshness. You can see business economics is a little bump above. This is the same as the screen from earlier. And then study aids down at the bottom is way below. But it's also, you can also see kind of it's a very small proportion of their inventory as well. The not left-hand side, but this part, I'm sorry, I'm pointing at it with my finger. I shouldn't do that, but where the thing that says share refers to the proportion or the percentage of inventory that genre represents in a bookstore. And the one in parentheses next to that, so art and architecture, for example, in this bookstore is 0.9%. And to the right of that, the average for other bookstores is in parentheses, so 1.2%. So in other words, this bookstore has slightly less as a percentage art and architecture than the typical bookstore, than the average. But you'll see that most of those numbers are fairly close in terms of percentage as well. So for example, sports, the store has 0.8% of their inventory is sports, and that's the average for the other bookstores as well, as 0.8%. So adult nonfiction, average, fine. But then you go over to adult fiction and you can see a lot of orange there. So there are more categories, 7 in fact, 7 fiction genres that are significantly or moderately below, I should say, moderately below the average in terms of freshness. So they're missing titles, potentially missing titles that could sell well. Again, this depends on the store and whether or not they really are an average kind of store, typical store. The point is not to become average in any way, but just to sort of have that knowledge. So there may be some factors that explain this, or it may just be that well, I don't know. There could be the number of factors. I was going to say missing some hot titles that kind of come up through other channels that they don't necessarily know about. And then that third section is youth, and you can see again, youth is even more average, so very yellow. Every single category is in the average zone. So let me see. I'm going to say that this does kind of validate the concept a little bit. So you can see, let me go back to this for a second, that even though the average turn for youth is higher than nonfiction, but the peer data shows it's more a function of kind of the genre dynamics than performance at that particular bookstore. So in other words, these adult fiction categories are stronger, generally speaking, in terms of freshness. Again, we would do this for the 4 metrics overall than nonfiction. So if we take a sort of next step, one more level down and look into a particular genre in a bit more detail, this is going to give us this chart I showed earlier that was kind of an overall report on this genre. So for mystery thriller, we're seeing here that they're moderately below. This gray line again is the benchmark. So if we look through these little numbered things, number 1 is this section here where it says 260 missing titles. So this is for relevance. According to this, they are more relevant than the typical bookstore in mystery thriller. So they're doing a decent job of having the right titles that people want and kind of keeping track of that mystery section. But there are still some books that they don't have that are selling well elsewhere. Again, despite the fact that it's above average, you might still want to have a look at those 8 titles that are selling in more than 50% of the bookstores and see what those are. They could be things where you've intentionally decided you just don't carry a certain series and so on, but it's interesting to know what they are and if you want to switch something out. The number 2 over in the right there, the right bottom, you'll see where it says key stats. This is showing me here some interesting stuff that mystery represents 6% of their inventory at this bookstore, whereas the typical or the average amount is 3.5%. So they have almost twice as much inventory as the average store, but that doesn't really seem to affect their turn. Their turn is still pretty decent in the average range. So they're just particularly strong in fiction or in all fiction or mystery in particular. And that could be to do with the demographics of the area they're in or a number of other things, or just maybe the merchandising of mystery, maybe it's right up front, maybe they're kind of primarily a mystery bookstore even. And then it shows you here that as a percentage of their sales, it represents 3.5%. So not as much, the percentage of their sales is quite a bit lower than the percentage of their inventory, but also again, quite a bit higher than the typical peers. The number 3 label here is showing me that they have 514 titles with no activity in the last year. And some of them, 107, have no activity in over 3 years. So some of them even more than 5 years. So the darker blue ones are mysteries that are getting pretty old. So something that this store might consider doing is returning some of those older mystery titles and possibly having a look at those returning some of those older titles and bringing in some of the things that may be missing compared to other bookstores. And that's almost certainly going to increase the turn for this section. And this is kind of what I was getting at with the low-hanging fruit. Like if you can find something where all you really need to do is identify 10 or 20 books to remove and return, maybe make sure you find the ones that are still returnable, and then maybe 5 to 10, if you want to shrink things a little bit, 5 to 10 books that are strong sellers that you don't carry, and replace those just kind of 1 for 1, or 2 for 1 if you're doing returns. You're almost bound to see kind of a bump in, of course, in relevance and in turnover, which is something you'd be able to see with this report in the next quarter. So you could say to yourself, the plan is to do something about mystery thriller, could be something fairly straightforward and easy to do, and then you can see how that affects things next time. So this is illustrating that. So like I said earlier, but didn't show, you can drill down to the title level from here. So drilling down to the title level for the stale titles is going to show you, is going to give you those ones that are more than between 3 and 5 or over 5 years on the shelf. So you'll see here there, and then also you get the market data to compare against. So if you're familiar with what we do for analytics already, or if you're not actually, if you're not familiar with it, what we do is to show a lot of our market data in terms of percentages. So we'll say, you know, this book has sold in 50% bookstores in the last X number of months or a year. And that kind of gives you a sense of, instead of just the raw number of how many copies sold, it gives you a sense of the breadth and the popularity sort of overall of the title. So this is showing you this. So in other words, this one that's coming up as the oldest, possibly the oldest book in this category, Death in Summer, is not selling anywhere else and nobody has it on hand. So that kind of confirms to you that, you know, unless William Trevor, I was going to say Trevor Williams, William Trevor is like lives down the street or something, this might be something where you can completely justify returning it. And of course, everything, but then of course you got Sue Grafton, who looks a bit different from that, but also this book has been on the shelf quite a long time, even though apparently she's still, they're still selling reasonably well elsewhere. And that's what I find kind of interesting about this list is there's 2 Sue Graftons here, which makes me think that this library, 2 Sue Graftons that have been sitting on the shelf for a long time, it makes me think that they're maybe keeping the whole alphabet. So they've got everything right from the beginning. And these 2 are from early in the alphabet, so the ones that people are probably more likely to have read. And then if you pop over to the right-hand side, these are the books where they're selling in over 50% of bookstores, but this particular library doesn't carry them. So here are the things you might swap in instead. So for some reason, they don't have Wise for Yesterday, at least not in hardcover. But everybody else seems to have it and is selling it. So again, sort of the end of the alphabet for Sue Grafton might be something worth bringing in. And then, of course, you can research the titles from here, click on the title and see if there are things you'd like to bring in. There's a P.D. James that maybe they missed from a couple of years ago. So basically that's, like I said, that swap, take out some of these, take out some of the returns that are returnable still, or pull some stuff off and put them on the sale shelf, and bring in, make a little bit of space, bring in some new things, and see how that goes. So I'm going to move on now to show you a little bit about Edelweiss Analytics in general. So if you already have Edelweiss Analytics, this is something you'll see now, but just to give you an idea of what we're doing in Edelweiss Plus to kind of bake in analytics data. So previously in older versions, you would have to go to another site and a completely different URL and pull up a completely different website, and really not integrated with Edelweiss Plus particularly well, or particularly at all. Now we've completely blended them together. There's a section within Edelweiss for analytics only. There's a page with multiple on it, but then also in all kinds of places in the program, there's going to be this kind of thing where you can see, if you're just looking at a title, for example, you're going to be able to see, or you have the option to look at the market data for every single title, just as you're going through a catalog or through any list, search results, list of tagged books and so on in Edelweiss. You're going to be able to see this market data. And also, it's not showing in this image, but we're just adding your own inventory data to the right-hand green bar as well. And then when you get into title level detail, we have sort of point of sale history. So just to back up, if you're not familiar with how this works, for analytics and for the scorecard or the shelf report, what we're doing is to grab point of sale data. So many of the point of sale systems cooperate with us and have programs that will send us for you. You don't need to really run reports, but you can get your POS system to send us automatically every night your sales and inventory and on order information. And that enables us to present that back to you in various useful places in Edelweiss Plus for buying or for getting into some of this more in-depth analytics. So if you have analytics as a subscription, then you're going to see an option when you go into the title detail. If you're familiar with this page, this is when you click on a title and you get a pop-up where you can see various bits and pieces about that title. So one of the options you would see there is point of sale data, and it will show you how well this title is sold at your shop for the last, well, since you've had it, actually is what it will show. It will show you how many you have now, lifetime sales, and last year's sales, the last 12 months. Also, from that same page, you'll be able to get to peer data, which is the other bookshops that are reporting data to us. So we won't tell you their names. This is an anonymous bookstore, but we tell you the region. So you can tell that somebody in the Northeast region has 3 on hand, none on order, and has sold 11. So that gives you a bit of idea, again, a bit more than just the percentages. It gives you the specifics of maybe even regionally how well things are doing. Another key thing with this, with analytics now too, is that again, anywhere in Edelweiss, this is not in the analytics specific part of the application, but anywhere in Edelweiss, if you're an analytics subscriber, you will have this little pie chart option. So if you're familiar with, Edelweiss Plus and the display modes, when you're looking at a list of titles, you can display them so that there's 2 across, or usually it's sort of a list of titles, but you can change that display for various kind of different layouts. So you would have an extra layout as an analytics subscriber. That's the icon for it is a little pie chart. So it's an analytics display mode, and if you click that, it will take whatever list of titles you're looking at. Could be titles that you've tagged, could be titles in a catalog, or it could be titles in an order, which is kind of cool. So you can do things like take a catalog from, take the Random House catalog from a year ago. Things that you've already bought have been coming in, and you could open up that catalog and then look at it in the analytics view and get a sense of how well, which of those books did well and didn't do so well, and kind of get a little bit to that DOA piece. Or you could look at it as an order and kind of get a sense of the sell-through of the whole order as opposed to the catalog overall. Or you could take something like any group of titles, like a promo or a regional catalog or something like that, and then just kind of monitor your inventory. And then finally, this is the page I mentioned. So there's a page, if you see this, it's awfully tiny. If you're already a subscriber, you should see at the top of your page an option for analytics. And when you click that, you'll see this kind of thing. So you will see a quick view of not yet released titles compared to your own inventory, the prioritization, category comparison. You see there at the bottom shows you which categories are on. There's trends over time. The top selling books that you don't have, or all of the top selling, all these can kind of be expanded out to show you a full list of titles, and then you can drill into a lot more detail from there. So, and we're adding more to this as we go, but if you have access to it, I'd encourage you to take a look and send us feedback if you have any thoughts on it. If you are interested in learning more, our website is abovthetreeline.com. You can go and we've got information about analytics and Edelweiss and all that kind of good stuff. And I hope that was interesting. That was the data part. Like I said, is something new where we're analyzing the data in slightly different ways from the traditional analytics we've done. We're looking at it in terms of benchmarking genres and averages. And that piece, the thing that we're calling the shelf report, is part of the Summit version of Edelweiss Analytics. So if you're already a subscriber, you will at some point be getting access to that. so that you can kind of track progress over time and so on. So Joe, are you there? Do you want to wrap things up?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth, and thanks everybody for joining us today. And again, we're going to be posting a recording of this video on our website, and you guys will probably get a link in an email as well. So thanks for joining us, and let us know if you have any questions. The best place is support@abovethetreeline.com. All right, thank you guys.
Okay, well, thank you. Bye.